6,000 men stopped 50,000, not by winning, not by advancing, by refusing to move. That is the part no one ever told you. Outnumbered, surrounded, and fully aware they would be left behind, 6,000 soldiers did not fight for victory. They fought to block time itself. For 9 days, they turned staying put into a weapon, and an entire enemy army into something unexpectedly stalled. This story does not fit how we like to remember war. We prefer breakthroughs, retreats, miracles. We do not talk about the men whose only task was to hold, knowing that holding meant sacrifice. While hundreds of thousands escaped, someone had to remain. While evacuation became legend, someone had to become invisible. 6,000 men were assigned that role, not officially, quietly. By necessity, German reports did not describe a collapse. They described resistance where none was expected. Progress slowed, assaults failed, losses rose. Not because the defenders were stronger, but because they accepted the one decision doctrine avoids at all costs: to block instead of survive. No one celebrated them. No victory was named after them. And almost no one explained why their choice mattered. This is not a forgotten battle. It is a forgotten decision. 6,000 blocked 50,000. And no one ever told you what that delay truly changed. If you've never heard this version of the story, stay with us, because what happened next explains why survival at Dunkirk was never accidental. Wars are usually explained through movement. Armies advance, fronts collapse, lines retreat, cities fall. Dunkirk is remembered the same way: a trapped force, a desperate evacuation, a miracle across the channel. But that version skips the most uncomfortable part of the story. Because before evacuation could succeed, something far less heroic had to happen. Someone had to stay. Someone had to hold ground that no longer mattered strategically, except for one brutal reason: time. At the end of May 1940, the Allied situation in northern France was already lost. German armored divisions had broken through the Ardennes, reached the Channel, and cut off British and French forces from the rest of the country. The map was clear. The pocket around Dunkirk would be crushed. Everyone involved understood this, including the men who would not be evacuated. What followed was not a misunderstanding, and it was not an accident. It was a decision made under pressure, without ceremony, and without guarantees. A small force was assigned to remain on the perimeter. Their task was not to defeat the enemy. It was to block them long enough for others to leave. 6,000 men were enough, or at least they would have to be. This is where the story usually jumps forward. Films rush to the beaches, speeches are remembered, ships appear on the horizon, but none of that happens unless the perimeter holds. And holding does not mean dramatic charges or sweeping counterattacks. Holding means refusing to give ground when every instinct tells you the position is already lost. The men assigned to this role knew exactly what it meant. They were not told they would be rescued. They were not promised reinforcement. They were given a single, brutally clear expectation: delay the enemy. Delay against numbers that should have erased them. Across the perimeter, German forces were massed in strength. Infantry divisions supported by armor, artillery, and air power were preparing to close the pocket. On paper, the outcome was predetermined. 50,000 men advancing against a force barely a fraction of their size. This is where belief enters the story. Not belief in victory, but belief in purpose. The defenders did not believe they could win. They believed something else mattered more: that if they could slow the advance, if they could force pauses, hesitations, regrouping, then time itself could be stretched. Hours would become days, days would become lifelines. This belief runs against most military logic. Doctrine emphasizes mobility, flexibility, and withdrawal when a position becomes untenable. Standing still, especially when outnumbered, is treated as a mistake, a waste of manpower, a failure of command. Yet here, standing still was the plan. The perimeter around Dunkirk was not a fortress. It was a patchwork of canals, streets, and hastily prepared positions. There was no depth, no fallback line that truly existed. Once pressure broke through in one sector, collapse could spread rapidly. The men defending it understood that too. which is why they did not fight as if they were holding a city. They fought as if they were holding a clock. Every crossing denied, every assault slowed, every meter contested, not because it mattered, but because it consumed time. This is the part history rarely pauses on, because it is difficult to celebrate. It asks an uncomfortable question: who decides who stays behind? While evacuation plans accelerated, while priorities shifted toward saving as many lives as possible, the perimeter forces remained fixed. They did not move toward the beaches. They did not drift backward with the flow of retreat. They stayed where the enemy expected weakness and made it solid. German commanders noticed immediately. Reports did not describe a disintegrating defense. They described unexpected resistance. Advances slowed. Attacks that should have succeeded stalled. Losses mounted in places assumed to be thinly held. This was not supposed to happen. A force this small was expected to break quickly. Instead, it absorbed pressure day after day, not through superior firepower, but through stubbornness, through men who understood that survival was no longer the metric. The paradox at the heart of Dunkirk is not the evacuation itself. It is the fact that evacuation required sacrifice to function. A visible miracle depended on an invisible delay. 6,000 men did not change the outcome of the campaign. France would still fall. Paris would still be occupied. The war would continue on other fronts. But for 9 days, they blocked 50,000. And in those 9 days, hundreds of thousands escaped. That is the decision no one likes to talk about. Not because it failed, but because it worked exactly as intended. The decision to hold the perimeter did not begin at Dunkirk. It began weeks earlier, when the map of Western Europe stopped behaving the way Allied planners expected. In May 1940, the prevailing assumption was simple. Any German offensive would repeat the logic of the previous war. A heavy push through Belgium, a grinding advance against prepared defenses. Time to react, time to maneuver. That assumption died in the Ardennes. German armored columns did not strike where the Allies were strongest. They moved through terrain considered unsuitable for large mechanized formations. Forests, narrow roads, areas labeled low risk on staff maps. The breakthrough at the Meuse was not just a tactical success. It was a psychological shock. Within days, German forces were moving faster than Allied command structures could process. Orders arrived late. Communications broke down. Units advanced or retreated based on fragmentary information. Speed became the weapon. By the time Allied commanders understood what was happening, German armor had already reached the Channel. The northern Allied armies were cut off from the rest of France. British, French, and Belgian units found themselves trapped in a shrinking pocket, pressed from multiple directions. This is the moment often described as inevitable, as if collapse simply followed momentum. But inevitability is a story told after the fact. In reality, there were choices. None of them were good. The pocket could attempt a breakout south. That option failed quickly. German forces were too fast, too well coordinated. The terrain favored the attacker. Losses mounted with little gain. The pocket could hold and wait for relief. That option existed only on paper. There were no reserves strong enough to punch through from the south. Air superiority was contested. Time was not on their side. The remaining option was evacuation. Evacuation, however, is not a single action. It is a process that demands stability. Ships cannot load under direct fire. Ports cannot function if enemy forces are advancing unchecked. Retreat without protection is not withdrawal. It is collapse. This is where the perimeter becomes essential. As plans for evacuation began to take shape, Allied commanders faced a brutal arithmetic. Every hour gained allowed more men to leave. Every hour lost turned the beaches into traps. The enemy did not need to destroy the evacuation force. They only needed to reach the port. To prevent that, the enemy had to be slowed. The perimeter around Dunkirk was not designed for prolonged defense. It was improvised. Canal lines were used as obstacles. Urban blocks became firing positions. Roads were blocked. Bridges prepared for demolition. Buildings turned into strong points. This was not elegant warfare. It was practical warfare. Holding such a line required men willing to fight without the expectation of maneuver. No flanking movements, no operational depth. Once committed, withdrawal would be difficult, if not impossible. That reality shaped the decision about who would stay. The forces assigned to the perimeter were not chosen at random. They included units trained for close combat, for holding ground under pressure, for operating with limited support. Naval infantry, line regiments, colonial troops, engineers, men accustomed to fighting without the illusion of rapid relief. But even training does not erase understanding. They knew the evacuation would not prioritize them. They knew ships would take others first. They knew air cover was limited and artillery support finite. What they were being asked to do was not heroic in the traditional sense. It was functional. They were being asked to become friction. German commanders expected speed to continue delivering results. The campaign had rewarded momentum. Units that advanced aggressively were successful. Hesitation was punished. The logic of blitzkrieg depended on continuous movement. The perimeter disrupted that logic. Each canal crossing demanded preparation. Each defended street required clearing. Each resistance pocket forced German units to slow, coordinate, and commit resources. None of this stopped the advance outright, but it changed its tempo, and tempo was everything. German reports from the period consistently reflect frustration rather than confusion. The enemy was not invisible. The objective was clear. What failed was the expectation of rapid collapse. Resistance appeared in places assumed to be thin. Attacks that should have broken through encountered stubborn defense. The pocket did not collapse as quickly as predicted. This delay had cascading effects. Artillery had to be brought forward. Air support redirected. Units earmarked for rapid exploitation became tied down in reduction operations. What was meant to be a swift closure became a grinding process. Meanwhile, evacuation accelerated. Ships moved continuously. Small vessels joined larger ones. Loading procedures were refined. Command structures adapted. The longer the perimeter held, the more efficient evacuation became. This relationship is rarely emphasized. Evacuation did not succeed despite resistance. It succeeded because resistance created predictability. A stable perimeter allowed planning. Planning allowed scale. The men holding the line understood none of this in abstract terms. They experienced it as repetition. Another attack, another bombardment, another order to hold positions already marked for destruction. They did not know how many ships had sailed. They did not know how many men had left. They only knew that the line had not yet been broken. This is the context in which the phrase 6,000 blocked, 50,000 acquires meaning. It was not a duel of strength. It was an imbalance of purpose. The attackers sought completion. The defenders sought delay. One side measured success in kilometers gained. The other measured it in hours consumed. By the time evacuation entered its final phase, the perimeter had done its job. Not cleanly, not cheaply, but effectively. The map had collapsed weeks earlier. What remained was not territory but time. And for 9 days, that time was held in place. The next question is unavoidable. What does it cost to hold time against an enemy who keeps advancing? That cost would soon become impossible to ignore. Delay works only as long as it can be sustained. After that, it turns into something else. By the 3rd day of holding the perimeter, the nature of the fighting around Dunkirk had changed. What began as a calculated effort to slow the enemy became a continuous test of endurance. The line was no longer being held to buy time in theory. It was being held because abandoning it would immediately collapse the evacuation. Every German advance now pressed against a defense that could not step back without consequence. This is the point where most defensive actions fail. Fatigue accumulates. Ammunition runs low. Command becomes fragmented. Small withdrawals turn into gaps. Gaps turn into breakthroughs. The perimeter did not break, but it began to bleed. German commanders adjusted quickly. If speed was being denied, pressure would replace it. Artillery concentrations increased. Urban areas were systematically reduced. Instead of rapid probes, assaults became deliberate. Infantry advanced behind heavy fire, supported by armor and close air attacks. The goal was no longer to rush the port, it was to crush the line. This shift exposed the defenders to the full weight of modern warfare. Positions that had held against probing attacks were now subjected to sustained bombardment. Houses collapsed, streets became kill zones, canals filled with debris and bodies. Holding time now meant absorbing force. For the men on the line, days blurred together. Night brought little relief. Attacks did not stop after sunset. Shelling continued. Small unit engagements erupted without warning. Sleep became fragmented. Supplies arrived inconsistently, if at all. Yet withdrawal was still not an option. Each sector of the perimeter had been assigned a simple instruction: hold as long as possible. There was no timetable for relief, no signal that evacuation would include them. As the days passed, the meaning of "as long as possible" became brutally clear. German reports from this phase no longer speak of surprise. They speak of resistance that refuses to dissolve. Pockets of defenders continued to fight after being bypassed. Units expected to be shattered remained coherent. Counterattacks, small and local, disrupted German coordination. This was not because the defenders were winning engagements. They were losing them slowly. Attrition favors the side that can replace losses. On paper, the Germans held that advantage. But attrition also favors the side willing to accept losses for a specific outcome. The defenders' outcome was not survival. It was delay. Each German battalion tied down on the perimeter was a battalion not advancing elsewhere. Each assault that required preparation consumed time. Each pause to reorganize, resupply, or bring up artillery extended the window for evacuation. The defenders were trading lives for hours. This exchange was not discussed openly. It did not need to be. Every man on the line understood the equation intuitively. When positions were overrun, survivors regrouped in nearby ruins. When ammunition ran out, rifles were conserved for close-range fire. When communications failed, units acted on the last order received. Hold. German commanders faced a growing dilemma. Pressing harder meant committing more forces into dense urban fighting, increasing losses. Pulling back to reorganize meant conceding time. Neither option aligned with the operational tempo they were accustomed to. The perimeter imposed friction on every decision. As days passed, the defenders' situation worsened. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Wounded men remained in forward positions. Evacuation of casualties was rare. Reinforcements did not arrive. Replacement units did not appear. Still, the line held. This persistence was not driven by morale in the abstract sense. It was driven by clarity. The defenders knew exactly what would happen if they broke. The evacuation would be exposed. The port would fall under direct attack. The beaches would become killing grounds. There was no illusion left, only function. By the middle of the defensive period, German assaults began to achieve partial successes. Sections of the perimeter were penetrated. Defensive depth shrank. The line no longer resembled a continuous barrier, but a series of strong points holding out independently. This fragmentation is normally fatal. Here, it became an advantage. German units were forced to reduce each pocket separately. Progress slowed further. Coordination became more complex. The attackers' numerical superiority was diluted across multiple engagements. What was meant to be a decisive closure turned into a series of costly reductions. Meanwhile, evacuation reached its most efficient phase. Procedures were refined. Traffic was managed. The flow of men across the channel increased. What had begun as a desperate improvisation became a systematic operation. This relationship was invisible to the men holding the line. They did not see the ships. They did not hear the numbers. They experienced only pressure. Yet their effect was measurable. Every additional day the perimeter held increased the scale of evacuation. Every failed assault translated directly into lives saved elsewhere. The defenders did not know the totals, but they sensed the weight of their role. German forces, accustomed to rapid operational success, now faced a different reality. Progress was being achieved, but at a cost and pace that no longer matched expectations. Losses accumulated. Fatigue set in. Momentum stalled. Attrition had become mutual. This is where the paradox of Dunkirk sharpens. The defenders were losing ground, losing men, and losing material. Yet strategically, they were winning time. The attackers were gaining ground, but losing tempo. Neither side could disengage easily. The defenders were committed by necessity. The attackers were committed by expectation. As the evacuation entered its final days, pressure intensified. German commanders sought decisive breakthroughs. Air attacks increased. Artillery fires became heavier. Assaults were launched across multiple sectors simultaneously. The objective was clear: break the perimeter before evacuation could conclude. For the defenders, this meant one thing: hold longer than planned. By this point, the idea of survival had largely vanished. Positions were held until they were physically destroyed or overrun. Small groups continued fighting after being cut off. Resistance did not end when lines were breached. It ended when ammunition ran out. This was not fanaticism. It was arithmetic. Every hour held was an hour gained elsewhere. Every position contested, no matter how small, added friction to the enemy's advance. The defenders had become a fixed cost the attackers could not avoid paying. By the time the perimeter's collapse became inevitable, its purpose had already been fulfilled. Evacuation was nearing completion. The bulk of Allied forces had crossed the Channel. The delay had worked, at a price. The question now was no longer whether the perimeter could hold. It was how the final hours would unfold once holding became impossible. That moment was approaching fast. By the final phase, the perimeter was no longer a line. It was a collection of exhausted positions clinging to relevance. German command no longer questioned whether the defense would collapse. The question was how much force would be required to make it collapse quickly enough to matter. Time had slipped away faster than expected. Evacuation was nearing its end. This shifted the enemy's intent. Speed was replaced by weight. Artillery fires intensified across the remaining defensive sectors. Urban districts were no longer contested block by block. They were flattened. Air attacks increased in frequency and coordination. Bombing was no longer harassment, it was preparation. The attackers were no longer probing for weakness. They were erasing resistance. For the defenders, the change was unmistakable. Positions that had survived days of pressure disappeared in minutes. Buildings collapsed entirely. Streets became impassable. Communications failed completely in some sectors. Command devolved to small unit leaders operating on instinct and last known orders. Hold. That single instruction still governed everything. As evacuation entered its final hours, priorities hardened. Allied command shifted focus almost exclusively to extracting remaining forces. There would be no new attempt to break the pocket. No relief column would arrive. The perimeter forces were now fully committed to their role, whether acknowledged or not. This is where belief gives way to reality. The men holding the line could hear the war changing around them. The sound of ships faded. The rhythm of evacuation altered. Fewer movements toward the beaches. More silence. More distance. They understood what that meant. Holding no longer protected an ongoing evacuation. It protected the conclusion of one. German units pressed forward with increasing aggression. Assaults were launched simultaneously across multiple sectors, designed to overwhelm coordination entirely. The goal was not to maneuver. It was to crush remaining resistance pockets before nightfall. Some positions fell quickly. Others held out longer than expected. In several areas, defenders continued fighting after being surrounded. Ammunition shortages forced closer engagement. Combat devolved into short-range exchanges fought from rubble, basements, and improvised barricades. At this stage, outcomes were no longer strategic. They were personal. Small groups chose where to make their stand. Some attempted limited withdrawals to delay further. Others stayed in place, knowing movement would only hasten collapse. There was no unified front left to coordinate, only shared understanding. German after-action reports from this phase describe a pattern that frustrated commanders. Resistance did not vanish when positions were taken. It reappeared behind them. Fire came from unexpected angles. Clearing operations took longer than planned. The defenders were no longer defending territory. They were consuming time in fragments. This fragmentation came at enormous cost. Casualties rose sharply. Medical care was nearly non-existent. Wounded men were often unable to move. Supplies were exhausted. Water and food became secondary concerns. Yet resistance continued. The paradox of the final hours is that the defenders were both defeated and effective. They were losing ground continuously, but the pace of advance still failed to match German expectations. Each destroyed position revealed another pocket behind it. Each success came later than planned. Night approached. For Allied command, this marked the point of no return. The last evacuation movements were executed. Ships departed under cover of darkness. What remained of the perimeter forces was no longer included in operational calculations. They had fulfilled their role. For the men still fighting, this moment arrived without announcement. There was no signal that the evacuation was complete, no formal order acknowledging the end, only the gradual realization that nothing more would come. The final pressure intensified accordingly. German forces, aware that time was now on their side, committed fully. Heavy weapons were brought forward. Direct assaults replaced cautious advances. Prisoners were rarely taken during active fighting. The objective was total reduction. In some sectors, defenders fought until their ammunition was gone. In others, resistance ended only when positions were physically destroyed. Small groups were isolated and overwhelmed. The perimeter ceased to exist as a functional defense. What remained was aftermath. As dawn approached, organized resistance collapsed. Survivors regrouped where possible. Some units attempted to withdraw toward the port, only to find it empty. Others surrendered when further fighting served no purpose. The silence that followed was abrupt. German forces secured the area systematically. The pocket was closed. The campaign moved on. On paper, the operation was complete. Yet something did not fit the numbers. The attackers had gained ground, but not at the speed they expected. The defenders had been defeated, but not quickly enough. Losses were higher than projected. Time had been lost that could not be recovered. For 9 days, a force that should have disappeared almost immediately had remained relevant. 6,000 men had blocked 50,000. Not forever. Long enough. The final pressure achieved its objective. The perimeter fell. The defenders were captured, killed, or scattered. There would be no victory declared for them, no moment of recognition, but the evacuation had ended successfully. Hundreds of thousands were gone. The men who made that possible were now absent from the story. What followed would determine whether they remained absent permanently. Because once the fighting stopped, another battle began, not on the ground, but in memory. When the fighting ended, the silence was not relief. It was accounting. German forces secured Dunkirk quickly after the final resistance collapsed. The perimeter no longer existed. What remained were prisoners, ruins, and reports to be written. The campaign moved on. Paris was still ahead. The war was far from over. On paper, Dunkirk appeared resolved, but the numbers told a different story. Over 9 days, approximately 338,000 Allied troops had been evacuated. The figure would become famous. It would be repeated in speeches, documentaries, and textbooks. It would stand as proof that something miraculous had occurred. Less often mentioned was what that number required. Tens of thousands of men had not been evacuated. They were captured in the final hours or killed during the defense. Many of them belonged to the units that had held the perimeter longest. The forces tasked with delay paid for it directly. This was not an oversight. It was a structural outcome. Evacuation prioritizes movement. Delay requires immobility. Those who stayed were never meant to be counted among the saved. Their role was to make saving possible. Once evacuation ended, their relevance to operational planning vanished almost instantly. German casualty reports from the Dunkirk perimeter did not align with expectations. Losses were higher than anticipated for an operation assumed to be a rapid closure. Units reported sustained resistance across multiple days, repeated assaults required to reduce positions, and delays that forced changes in artillery and air support allocation. These reports did not describe a broken enemy. They described one that refused to dissolve on schedule. From a military perspective, the outcome was paradoxical. The attackers achieved their objective. The pocket was closed. Prisoners were taken. Territory was secured. Yet the defenders had achieved theirs as well. Evacuation was completed at a scale that should not have been possible under pressure. Both sides could claim success, depending on how success was defined. This ambiguity would not survive long. History prefers clarity. In the days that followed, attention shifted rapidly. France would soon sign an armistice. The collapse of the country overshadowed everything that had happened at Dunkirk. The narrative of defeat absorbed smaller, more complex stories. The men who had held the perimeter became part of that absorption. They did not fit the dominant explanations. They did not support the idea that France collapsed because its soldiers could not fight, nor did they align neatly with the story of heroic escape that other nations needed to tell. So their role faded. This fading was not coordinated. No order was issued to erase them. It happened naturally, through emphasis and omission, through repetition of certain numbers and neglect of others, through the human tendency to simplify complex events into digestible myths. The evacuation became the story. The delay became a footnote. Over time, even that footnote grew faint. The phrase 6,000 blocked 50,000 does not appear prominently in post-war summaries. The focus shifts to ships, speeches, and symbols. The men who remained on land while others crossed water became background noise. This is how absence works in history, not through denial, but through silence. Yet the evidence never disappeared. German archival material consistently reflects frustration at the pace of operations around Dunkirk. After-action reports reference resistance that exceeded expectations. Timelines show delays inconsistent with the assumed weakness of the defenders. Loss figures contradict the idea of a swift reduction. These documents were not written to flatter the enemy. They were written to explain deviations from plan. They explain something else as well. Delay is measurable. Every day the perimeter held increased the evacuation total. Every stalled assault translated directly into lives saved elsewhere. This relationship is not rhetorical. It is logistical. Ships do not appear instantly. Men do not board simultaneously. Evacuation scales with time. The defenders created that scale. They did so knowing they would not benefit from it. Their reward was not survival, recognition, or victory. It was the knowledge that their immobility had purpose. That purpose would later be obscured by broader narratives. For the nations involved, Dunkirk became useful in different ways. For Britain, it was a foundational moment of endurance. For France, it was subsumed by the larger trauma of defeat and occupation. For others, it became a prelude to later victories. In each case, the perimeter defense complicated the story. It suggested that defeat was not uniform, that resistance did not vanish simply because strategy failed, that outcomes were shaped by decisions made under impossible conditions by men with limited choices. These are uncomfortable truths. They resist heroic framing. They challenge simple blame. They demand attention to actions that do not end well for those who take them, so they are often left aside. What remains is a cleaner version of events, a miracle without cost, an evacuation without a guard, a success without an exchange. But history does not work that way. Every successful withdrawal depends on someone holding the door. Every escape requires delay. Every miracle rests on an invisible calculation. At Dunkirk, that calculation was written in lives. 6,000 men did not change the outcome of the war. They changed the outcome of that moment. They blocked 50,000, long enough for the impossible to happen. Then they disappeared from the story. Until now, because silence is not the same as absence, and forgetting is not the same as erasure. The question that remains is not what they did. It is why their decision was allowed to fade so completely. That question leads away from the battlefield and into the machinery of memory itself. History is not erased. It is edited, not by a single hand, and rarely with malicious intent. It is shaped by repetition, by emphasis, by what fits cleanly into the stories societies tell themselves after catastrophe. Dunkirk was a catastrophe in need of meaning. For Britain, the evacuation was not a victory, but it could be framed as survival. Survival required morale. Morale required a story that transformed retreat into resolve. The focus naturally settled on what crossed the water, not on what remained behind it. That focus was not dishonest. It was selective. For France, the problem was different. Dunkirk occurred inside a larger collapse that followed too quickly for nuance. The armistice came weeks later. Occupation followed. The country entered a period where survival itself became fragmented. In that context, a story about men who fought and lost ground did not serve an immediate purpose. It did not explain defeat, nor did it offer a clear path forward. It was easier to let the moment dissolve into the larger narrative of 1940. Silence, in this case, was not imposed. It was convenient. Memory favors outcomes with clean edges, victories, defeats, turning points that can be summarized in a sentence. Dunkirk's perimeter defense had no clean edge. It worked precisely because it did not end well for those who carried it out. That makes it difficult to place. The evacuation could be commemorated. The delay could not. Delay is invisible by nature. It does not announce itself. It leaves no monument. Its success is measured in what happens elsewhere, not where it occurs. The men who held the line did not capture territory. They did not destroy the enemy. They did not survive to tell their version of events in large numbers. Their contribution existed entirely in negative space. Advances that did not happen, attacks that arrived too late, ships that sailed because someone else did not move. This is not how memory prefers to work. Over time, repetition reinforced the simpler story. Numbers were cited without context. Images circulated without explanation. Each retelling emphasized movement across the channel and minimized resistance on land. Once established, this framing became self-sustaining. Later generations did not actively forget the perimeter defense. They were simply never introduced to it as central. Textbooks summarized, documentaries condensed, films focused on visuals that could be shown. Beaches, ships, skies. A fixed defense that exists to slow an enemy does not translate easily to spectacle. Even when archival material contradicted simplified narratives, it remained secondary. Reports written by German officers describing stubborn resistance did not align with the idea of a rapid, almost bloodless closure. They complicated the story. Complexity is rarely rewarded in popular memory. This does not mean the truth vanished. It remained available to those who looked for it. Military archives preserved reports. Unit histories recorded losses. Individual testimonies survived in fragments. But availability is not the same as visibility. What people remember is not what exists. It is what is repeated. Over decades, Dunkirk became shorthand for evacuation. The perimeter became an implied assumption, not an examined reality. The idea that a smaller force deliberately accepted annihilation to create time never fully entered the mainstream narrative. That omission shaped perception. It reinforced the belief that collapse equals weakness, that once a front breaks, resistance evaporates. That defeat is uniform across all units involved. The perimeter defense contradicts all three assumptions. It shows that soldiers can fight effectively even when strategy fails. That resistance can exist without hope of victory. That outcomes are not binary. These are inconvenient lessons. They complicate blame. They challenge pride. They resist appropriation. So they are often left alone. The story of 6,000 men blocking 50,000 does not belong easily to any national myth. It does not prove superiority. It does not justify policy. It does not promise redemption. It simply describes a decision made under impossible conditions, and the consequences that followed. That is why it fades. Not because it was insignificant, but because it offers no comfort. Memory preserves what societies need. It neglects what they do not know how to use. Dunkirk's perimeter defense falls into that neglected category. Too costly to celebrate, too effective to dismiss, too specific to generalize. And yet, its significance remains. Every evacuation since has relied on the same logic. Someone must hold while others leave. Someone must accept exposure so that movement can occur elsewhere. That logic is timeless. What happened at Dunkirk was not an anomaly. It was an example. The fact that it took decades to be examined properly says less about the event itself and more about how uncomfortable its lesson is. Because if delay can be decisive, then sacrifice can be strategic. And if sacrifice can be strategic, then not all losses are failures. That idea unsettles neat histories, which is why it waits patiently, just beneath the surface, until someone is willing to look at it directly. The effect of delay is rarely visible where it happens. It appears somewhere else, later, often under a different name. At Dunkirk, the immediate result of holding the perimeter was obvious. Ships sailed, men crossed. The evacuation concluded. That outcome is easy to quantify and easy to remember. What is harder to see is what that evacuation enabled next. When the last ships left the port, the war did not pause. It shifted. Britain did not celebrate Dunkirk as a triumph at the time. It treated it as survival. Survival, however, created continuity. Continuity allowed planning. Without the evacuation, Britain would have faced a strategic collapse. The loss of the core of its trained army would have forced decisions that were not reversible. Defense of the home islands would have been compromised. Future operations would have been delayed or abandoned entirely. The men who crossed the Channel did not simply escape danger. They carried experience, cohesion, and institutional memory with them. These were not abstract assets. They were the foundation of everything that followed. Rebuilding an army from scratch takes years. Preserving one under pressure takes days of delay. Those days were purchased on the perimeter. This is where the significance of 6,000 blocking 50,000 extends beyond Dunkirk itself. The defenders did not alter the German campaign in France. That campaign would succeed regardless. What they altered was the strategic balance after France fell. Britain remained in the war as a functioning military power, not merely defiant, but capable. That distinction matters. A country without an army can resist rhetorically. A country with an army can shape outcomes. The evacuated forces would go on to form the core of later operations. They would train, reorganize, and expand. They would absorb new equipment and new allies. They would fight again under different circumstances. None of that was guaranteed in late May 1940. At that moment, nothing beyond survival was assured. Delay created space for choice. It allowed Britain to reject immediate compromise. It allowed time for alliances to evolve. It allowed resources to be mobilized. It allowed morale to stabilize, not through illusion, but through continuity. This continuity is often misinterpreted as inevitability, as if Britain's continued resistance was preordained. It was not. It was contingent. Contingent on ships arriving. Contingent on ports functioning. Contingent on an enemy being slowed long enough for movement to occur. All of those contingencies depended on the perimeter holding. The defenders did not know this in strategic terms. They did not imagine future campaigns or global outcomes. They understood something simpler. If the line broke too soon, evacuation would fail. Their world was measured in hours. The consequences were measured in years. This is how tactical decisions shape strategic reality. Not by brilliance alone, but by alignment. A small action becomes decisive when it supports a larger process at the exact moment it is needed. The perimeter defense did not win the war. It made winning the war possible. That distinction is uncomfortable because it resists heroic framing. It does not offer a climax where the underdog triumphs. It offers something more restrained and more accurate. It offers causality. When historians later examine the period, they often separate Dunkirk from what followed. The evacuation is treated as an endpoint. The Battle of Britain becomes the next chapter. Operations elsewhere take over the narrative. This separation obscures the connection. The Battle of Britain is not conceivable without Dunkirk's outcome. Air defense, command structures, ground forces, and political resolve all depended on the survival of the army. Not its intactness, but its existence. Delay made that existence possible. There is a second effect that is rarely acknowledged. German expectations were shaped by momentum. The early campaign rewarded speed, surprise, and aggressive exploitation. When the perimeter held longer than anticipated, it disrupted assumptions about how quickly objectives could be achieved. This did not reverse German success, but it introduced friction. Friction alters planning. Planning alters risk tolerance. Risk tolerance alters decisions. The delay did not stop the German advance. It forced recalculation at a moment when confidence was high and resources were being allocated rapidly. This recalculation consumed attention and time that could not be recovered. Again, the effect is subtle. It does not appear as a dramatic reversal. It appears as hesitation, adjustment, caution. War is shaped as much by these small inflections as by decisive blows. The defenders at Dunkirk created one such inflection. They forced the attackers to spend more than expected to achieve less than intended. They turned speed into weight and weight into cost. They imposed a tax on momentum. This tax did not bankrupt the campaign, but it mattered. The final effect is perhaps the most human. Survival changes perception. The men who evacuated carried with them the knowledge that survival had been earned by others who did not share it. This awareness influenced how the war was understood by those who fought on. It reinforced the idea that outcomes were collective, not individual. That success depended on actions taken by people who might never be acknowledged. This awareness rarely survives in official histories, but it shapes those who experience it. 6,000 men did not receive monuments for blocking 50,000. They did not become symbols. They did not enter the war as a turning point. They became a condition that made later moments possible. That is why their story matters, even without victory attached to it. It explains how wars are actually decided, not by singular triumphs, but by sequences of decisions that create or remove options. At Dunkirk, one such decision was made with brutal clarity: stay, hold, delay. The men who carried it out did not know what would follow. They only knew what would happen if they failed. They did not fail. What remains now is not to praise them or to retrofit meaning onto their actions, but to recognize the mechanism they revealed. Delay is power. Time is terrain. And sometimes, the most decisive action is refusing to move. That lesson does not belong to one nation or one battle. It belongs to anyone willing to look past outcomes and examine causes. The final step is to close the circle, not with celebration, but with understanding. History often remembers motion, advances, retreats, breakthroughs. It struggles with stillness. At Dunkirk, stillness was the point. 6,000 men did not march into legend. They did not seize ground or reverse a campaign. They occupied space that was already lost and refused to leave it. In doing so, they turned time into something tangible, something that could be held, measured, and spent. That choice is difficult to frame as victory. It is even harder to frame as success. And yet, it worked. The evacuation that followed would become one of the most remembered episodes of the war. Speeches would be written. Symbols would emerge. Images would circulate for generations. What remained behind those images was a quieter truth. Every ship that sailed did so because someone else stayed. Every escape depended on delay. This relationship is uncomfortable because it exposes the structure beneath the story. It reveals that survival is often purchased, not granted. That outcomes we celebrate are built on decisions that are never meant to be remembered. The men who held the perimeter were not asked to make history. They were asked to make time. They did not know how many would escape. They did not know how long they would be required to hold. They did not know whether their actions would matter beyond the next few hours. They acted anyway. In that sense, Dunkirk is not exceptional. It is representative. Throughout war, delay shapes outcomes more often than victory. Rear guards slow advances. Covering forces absorb pressure. Sacrifice creates space for maneuver elsewhere. These actions rarely receive attention because their success is invisible. When delay works, nothing dramatic happens where it occurs. Things happen somewhere else. The perimeter defense at Dunkirk fits this pattern perfectly. It mattered precisely because it prevented something from happening too soon. It created absence. It shaped events by subtraction. This is why it fades from memory. Stories need conclusions. Delay offers none. It ends not with triumph, but with exhaustion, capture, or silence. It leaves no clear marker to commemorate. And yet, without it, the story collapses. 6,000 men blocked 50,000. Not indefinitely, not heroically, long enough. That duration changed what followed. It allowed an army to survive. It allowed a nation to choose resistance over resignation. It preserved continuity at a moment when collapse seemed inevitable. These outcomes are easy to misattribute. They can be mistaken for resilience, luck, or destiny. In reality, they were contingent on a decision made under impossible conditions by men who would not benefit from its success. That decision did not guarantee victory. It guaranteed possibility. History often assigns credit to those who move forward. It rarely pauses to examine those who stand still. Dunkirk asks us to reconsider that instinct, because sometimes standing still is not hesitation. It is commitment. The men who held the line did not ask to be remembered. They asked only that their position hold long enough to matter. It did. What remains is not a call to glorify sacrifice or to romanticize loss. It is an invitation to understand how outcomes are built. Time is not neutral. It is shaped, and shaping it often requires someone to absorb the cost. At Dunkirk, that cost was paid quietly. 6,000 men blocked 50,000. No one ever told you why that mattered. Now you know. And once you see it, you begin to notice it everywhere else. If this story changed how you understand Dunkirk, consider subscribing. We focus on the decisions history rarely explains, not the legends, but the mechanisms that shape them. Leave a comment with the part that surprised you most. History only survives when it's questioned.